Welcome and good evening to another episode of the News Project Live. This is episode 6. We'll be covering education and financing journalism in turbulent times. Our guest is Elizabeth Green, CEO, co-founder of Chalkbeat, and co-founder of the American Journalism Project. The News Project Live is a weekly conversation with media industry experts and innovators about the future of news, brought to you by the News Project. Our hosts are Merrill Brown, CEO, and Alex Leo, Head of Audience. We're live on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube.
Good evening. From New York City, I'm Merrill Brown of the News Project, and welcome to tonight's edition of the News Project Live. Right here every Thursday, we bring together some of the smartest minds in media to talk about some of the toughest issues the news industry faces. We focus on the business of news gathering and the things that make the news business so challenging. Tonight, our guest is one of those great minds, Elizabeth Green, who not only is the co-founder of Chalkbeat, one of the most innovative education sites in the country, but also the co-founder of the American Journalism Project, which is seeking to raise $1 billion to support the struggling local news business. So far, they've raised nearly $50 million and late last year made 11 grants. At the heart of Elizabeth Green's projects is the view that commercial local news is dying and that a new nonprofit model is required. Her view of Chalkbeat, quote, "Our belief about Chalkbeat is that this news isn't supposed to be paid for. Given that reality, we realized we need to treat news as a mission, a public good. Paywalls make no sense to us, but prolific partnerships do," close quote. That assessment of the news model is also at the heart of her view about the news future. And at this moment of national reflection and media industry efforts to rethink the model, we're eager to hear from our guest. At the News Project, we're working to build technology and services to help small and medium-sized newsrooms address their product and business challenges and reach audiences, whether on computer or phone. Among our goals is to support startups by providing them the capabilities they need to be successful. More on our work later in the program when co-host Alex Leo and I debrief. Good evening, Alex.
Hi, Merrill.
You're not home in DC. That's one of the things that changed this week. You took a road trip and I got a haircut, both evidence that we're coming out, at least in small steps, from lockdown.
Yes. I am COVID free after a long period of quarantine. I have never had the disease, knock wood. And so I've come to see my father for his 85th birthday. And welcome all. Thanks for joining us. A reminder to send us your questions for our guests. Tag your friends and share this post wherever you're watching from, and also let us know where you're watching from. Merrill?
On to our show tonight. Thanks, Alex. Elizabeth Green is a native of Silver Spring, Maryland, as I am. She's a graduate of Harvard, as I am not. She's a former education writer and a Spencer Fellow at Columbia. She founded Chalkbeat 12 years ago, and the site now covers education at 7 local markets around the country. She and investor and Texas Tribune founder John Thornton founded last year the American Journalism Project, and their work is well underway. Alex?
Elizabeth joins us from the DC area and will first fill us all in on life with a 1-year-old in lockdown. Good evening, Elizabeth.
Hi.
Hi. How is it being in lockdown with a tot?
It's good. I'm very lucky. I have a good situation here. Quarantining with my parents, who are providing us free childcare. So
wonderful.
I feel incredibly grateful to be in the tool shed. My dad's tool shed.
Yeah. Well, let's dive right into the discussion of the protests in the wake of the murder of George Floyd. In a post for Chalkbeat, you wrote that Black Lives Matter and went on to explain, when we write about the public school system, we know it is founded on and imbued with a legacy of systems of racial oppression, as so many institutions are. We know that schools must themselves embrace anti-racism if they are to serve all children. We know the legacy press is another institution imbued with racism. As we recreate local news, we must dismantle the journalistic practices and traditions that uphold white supremacy, such as overwhelmingly white male ownership structures, disproportionately white newsrooms and newsroom leadership, and a tradition of objectivity that silences the voices and perspectives of the majority of Americans who are members of marginalized groups, and eschews writing directly about the uncomfortable truths. Only if journalists embrace anti-racism can we fulfill our potential to serve Americans of all races and backgrounds with the news and information they need to participate in civic life. What does this moment mean to you and to Chalkbeat's mission?
Yeah, it's, my own story, as Merrill, you said, starts in Silver Spring, Maryland, where I've now returned to quarantine. The reason that I'm a journalist really is in part a teacher and in part a student. I had a high school journalism teacher who was incredible and imbued me with the mission of journalism and created experiences for me, such as one that kind of fundamentally set me on my path, which had me marching across the cafeteria from the place where my friends sat, kids who mostly looked like me, were also college bound, had parents who went to college, marched across the cafeteria and interviewed kids who didn't look like me and weren't college bound, didn't have parents who went to college. And in many of those encounters had a big impact on me, but one of them was especially profound when a Black student told me, everybody thinks that I'm going to go off and be a welfare mom. Nobody thinks that I'm going to be successful. My teachers look at me and don't call on me. If they do call on me, they expect nothing of me. People, my whole life, I've been fighting, and I'm going to continue to fight for people to see me differently. And I really need to change those views. And I said, whose views? And she said, yours, you. And I sort of confronted in that moment my white privilege and inequities in education. It was the beginning of a long journey. And so, racial inequality is just a fact in the American story. It starts from the beginning of our American story with slavery and continues on from there. Segregated schools, separate but equal, Jim Crow, and continuing on today in deep inequities in how schools are financed and how the outcomes that students face. So, everything that I've set out to do in journalism has been to tell that story and to be a part of changing public education by writing about it honestly. And so at this moment, it's a moment of reckoning for all of us in so many ways. And it just seemed wildly inappropriate that, honestly, that we hadn't said to date yet in such plain language that Black Lives Matter from Chalkbeat, and that we commit to anti-racism. It's certainly a good time to do that is now. So that's what we did.
That's great.
And what might that mean to the coverage of Chalkbeat and the directions you take with the product?
So, we've always focused on covering educational inequities. That's been the mission from day one. And to me, that's really shaped by my own experiences in legacy media, short as they were. I could see, and anyone can see as a reader, whose experiences are prized and whose experiences are prioritized, and who we assume our readers are. So Chalkbeat from day one, we've said we're not covering the schools that have the most affluent students. We're covering the schools that have the students who are most historically have been marginalized from the potential of public education. First of all, it's just a good story to tell. It's a really important story to tell. But second, it's important to prioritize that story, just given how many kids that story affects and how many, all of us that story affects. So we have always put serving communities affected by poverty and racism and many forms of marginalization first. But and we've also always, focused on that part of the story. But I think just like, so many of us in this world, especially white people, I don't think we have been as direct always over time in writing about race as we need to. And we're going to keep working to improve on that. We certainly don't have as representative of a staff of our readers and the students we write about as we would like to. And we're going to keep committing to changing that. There's a lot of including of people in our reporting that we have always prioritized, but we can always get more and more sensitive about that and open about that and honest about where we're not succeeding.
And you mentioned, school integration and desegregation earlier, but that's still going on, right? I mean, Chris Murphy said last week, I think, it's time to integrate Connecticut schools, right? That's still happening across the country.
Oh, yes, yeah. Absolutely. Yes. Yes. Schools are deeply segregated, deeply segregated by race and class.
There are two big stories right now. Obviously, they dominate our lives and news coverage in many ways. The other one, obviously, is COVID-19. You've covered that aggressively. And I think one thing that's on everybody's mind watching us tonight and reading Chalkbeat.
When the F will my kids go back to school?
Well, your words, not mine, but what's going to happen this fall?
Yeah, we're in a crisis on top of a crisis on top of a crisis in so many ways. There's school districts are starting to put forward their reopening plans, but it's still really early days, even though schools in many parts of the country open earlier than those of us who remember starting in September believe or understand. So it's not so far away that schools will reopen, and nothing is going to be predictable. A lot of school districts are, playing around with schedules that allow for reduced exposure and social distance, beefing up. They're going to have to beef up the health resources at schools. And certainly many educators will say they would love to beef up the social emotional resources for students, especially students for whom the current realities in our world are invoking so many kinds of trauma, not just the trauma maybe of losing multiple loved ones or of being part of a community like the Black community, like the Latinx community that has seen so many people lost to COVID disproportionately, but also the police violence and the unrest that is following from those images that are deeply disturbing images of police killing unarmed Black people. And so there's a lot that students are going to be processing, and all of this is going to happen amidst a backdrop of state governments and municipal governments that are seeing their tax bases dramatically slashed because of the economic consequences of the pandemic. And so just at the moment that schools need more resources, arguably, than they ever have needed, and it's always been quite a lot of resources that schools require, they're facing in some places just absolutely severe doomsday scenarios for cuts that they will have to make. And so you saw school education leaders speak in front of the Senate this week saying we need a massive education bailout. And I don't think this is just a 1 year or fall problem. This is going to be an ongoing challenge. Remote learning is going to continue, arguably, but remote learning is deeply inequitable. It exacerbates existing inequalities. Some kids, if you're lucky, are getting exposure to an educator remotely. Other kids are getting paper packets, and that's it. Still other kids have not been touched at all by an educator, whether that's because of a language barrier or a digital divide. So there are so many challenges facing schools at this moment.
Yeah, Elizabeth, I want to take a second to thank everyone watching. Nancy, Aparna, Sri, Rose, thank you for tuning in, and remember to tag your friends. Elizabeth, I wanted to get back to what we were just talking about. We saw in Chalkbeat's recent coverage stories about educators and their challenges at this moment, some of them saying this is why they teach. Can you tell us about that side of the coverage, about what teachers are going through and what you're learning?
Yeah, teachers are asked always to be in this country, to be more than an educator, to be in many ways a social worker, providing social emotional supports, providing many of them through their own volition, access to services that their students need. And so at a time of just tremendous need for everyone, for all of us, teachers are really seeing that their work, the need for their work and is increasing. And a lot of them are really rising to the occasion in amazing ways. I mean, they all are, I think. Even as teachers, just like all of us are people living through this pandemic as well, right? We've seen teachers, principals, people who work in schools in non-teaching positions lose their lives to COVID. We've seen, a lot of teachers are parents with young children themselves, and so they're struggling themselves, as so many of us are, with childcare and work. How can they care for the kids on the other side of the computer while also caring for the kids on their knee? It's a challenging time for teachers.
While we're on the subject of Chalkbeat, and before we get to the American Journalism Project, we at the News Project, as you know, are dedicated to encouraging entrepreneurial journalism. It's becoming a term of art, and you have been masterful at building something over more than a decade that has meaning and value. What would you like to say to journalists who would like to do something in a category or in a community that would be helpful and utilitarian in terms of putting them in a position to be successful, hopefully as successful as you at Chalkbeat have been?
I think that what is asked of all of us in this moment of time is to think big about how we want to shape the world as we go on from here. And so journalists, we're all a big part of that. I know for some of us, it's challenging to do our jobs as normal when nothing seems even remotely normal in the world around us. But I think that as journalists, we have such an important and sacred role to play right now to really convene conversation that puts real people at the table about the stakes of the times in front of us, and arm everyone with the facts. That is an incredible, amazing responsibility. We also have a responsibility to make sure that we can continue to do that work. And to do that, we need to create new business models to support the mission that drew all of us to this profession. And so I think, if you're interested in thinking about the business model part of it, which I'm sure all of us are having to do, whether it's because you have seen too many rounds of layoffs or because you're trying to decide whether you can afford to stay in this profession amid so much uncertainty, I do think that finding a way to participate in or start a new journalistic entity right now is a really important way that we can all contribute to this moment in time. It's a moment of really a lot of despair and pain, but out of that, we must build hope, right? And one of the ways to do that is to build a better media than we had before. And that starts with a new business model that it's got to be mission driven. And I think most of those will be nonprofits.
Elizabeth, we definitely want to get into business models coming up out of this. But Merrill, you mentioned TNP, what we're doing here. Can you tell everyone a little bit more about the News Project?
Sure. Thanks, Alex. Bear with us for a minute, Elizabeth. The News Project is dedicated at its very essence to helping entrepreneurs like Elizabeth and thousands of others here and around the world become more successful, and most importantly, to have the tools and the platform capabilities they need to be successful. We have built News Business in a Box at the News Project that allows our customers to get everything they need to run a successful business, from 75 templates we've built to capabilities around reader revenue and other tools, to all the business, technical, and design things that make news sites and their mobile products wonderful. So please be in touch with us about the business of the News Project. We'd love to help you. If you're an entrepreneur thinking about this, we'd be happy to talk to you as well. And you can write me at Merrill@thenewsproject.net, or Alex, who is alex@thenewsproject.net. And we are the News Project, and hopefully we'll be hearing from you, and we'd love to help you reach the same kinds of extraordinary goals that Elizabeth has. Alex?
Thank you, Merrill. So Elizabeth, back to the business models. You have been critical of advertiser-supported business models. Can you tell us more of that, about that going forward? I mean, obviously in this time we've seen reader subscriptions go up for places, but advertising fall off a cliff.
Oh, I'm all for advertising as long as it supports the mission. And
Great.
My problem with totally advertising dependent business models for local news is that they don't work. So
Right.
Advertising as a piece of the puzzle, I think, is a beautiful, wonderful thing. Advertising as the only driver is not going to be enough to get the coverage that we need, not anywhere close. And really, the biggest concern I have is with ownership structures of media that are not putting the mission first, and that put shareholders before the mission of journalism, which should be to serve the democracy, to serve people with the information and news that they need to make decisions about the world that we want to have in this democracy, the institutions we want to build, the services that we deserve, and to have that feedback loop of responsive government, responsive democracy. You need a press that's not accountable to anything but telling the truth and serving that process. And that's just the opposite, unfortunately, of what we're seeing from large corporate structures that are accountable only to shareholders. They are not serving those needs. Their local newspapers have become, sadly, it's more effective to meet the goals if you're working at a local paper to put up a viral video that is probably racially insensitive and to say the least, and than it is to write an article about your actual community. I think probably a lot of people watching this have seen the same studies about what's happening to local newspapers, if not have been forced themselves as journalists to write stories they don't believe in or think are important. But local communities deserve stories about their actual community and about things that really matter to that community. We don't need more analysis of celebrity Twitter.
We're slightly more hopeful than you are about the upside of advertising in local media, and we're training people every day to be more effective sellers at it, and think that's important. Hopefully you agree, and hopefully we'll be proving that in some places and helping folks like you recognize not just reader revenue, which is important, and not just philanthropy, but advertising, which is still out there, and people are going to get it, and news might as well.
Oh, we saw ads at Chalkbeat. I think the ads are great. I love ads. I mean, advertisers are supporting the mission too. That's really important. So I don't disagree at all that advertising in itself has anything wrong with it.
That's an excellent segue to the American Journalism Project, which is as bold an undertaking as Chalkbeat. It's now over a year old. Share with us a bit about what motivated you to activate a whole other side of your career and start a big philanthropic undertaking.
I cover education, and so in watching the education sector, I have a close-up, real-life, big example of what it looks like to solve what is effectively a market failure through the energy of entrepreneurship that's such a hallmark of, I would say, my generation, but also paired with the mission-driven purposefulness that's another like super millennial thing, right? And so this concept of a social entrepreneur in education is very common. It's somebody who maybe worked as a teacher or experienced inequity in their own educational experience as a student and says, I want to solve the problem that I see by creating some new organization or institution that can meet that problem with a solution. And that, then they go out and they write a mission statement and they seek philanthropic support to get going. And some of these organizations have grown massively across the country, whether it's the City Year Service Program, Year of Service Program, which has expanded dramatically over the years, or so many examples in public health and education of programs that seek to serve these market failures. Journalism, in my view, is another market failure. We could float for several decades on a purely commercial model, but that's not the case anymore, especially at the local level. Local news has been decimated and commercial models are not meeting the need. And so to my mind, one of the clear things that we were missing, and certainly that I at Chalkbeat was missing, was the infrastructure that exists to support social entrepreneurship. When people with missions and teams of people set out to change the world, they need things. They need support and they need money. And money needs to be not money to do one program over here and one program over here, but rather to build the capacity of an organization to sustain and grow over the long term. And those kinds of institutions do exist in other sectors. One of the names for them is a venture philanthropy. So the American Journalism Project, John Thornton, who himself is a social entrepreneur and creating the Texas Tribune in Texas, he and I had a very similar idea that philanthropy could be used in a much more muscular way to aggressively grow the available local news and to make sure that the local news that we provide is long-term sustainable, has strong institutions behind it. So we created the American Journalism Project. It's the first venture philanthropy organization in the country. We're extremely proud to have worked with a great group of philanthropists and a great founding team. To get started, we just brought on our first CEO, Sarah Beth Berman, and she's fantastic, comes from the education field. So she brings a lot of the great knowledge and experience from that field that I've seen firsthand again to journalism, which she cares deeply about. And we're extremely lucky to have supported some really fantastic local news outlets across the country and are excited to support more.
And how will you get from roughly 50 million to $1 billion?
So what is $1 billion? $1 billion is our estimate of how much money needs to be spent annually on news gathering at the local level. And so our goal is to create all the news gathering that America needs. And we have to be really honest, I think all of us in the journalism field and anyone who cares about our democracy, about what that's going to cost. It costs money to have reporters show up at city council meetings, at school board meetings, at local planning meetings, in the state legislature. Whether that's virtually or in person, it takes a person to be there and write the story. It takes people to ask their fellow citizens what they care about and why, and then answer those questions for them with professional, rigorous reporting. So we put a number on how much we think is missing annually, and the way we think that we get to $1 billion the most quickly is by creating institutions which we give the capacity they need to grow rapidly. So Chalkbeat is a great example. We started with a tiny little grant from a single philanthropist, and now we had a $9 million operating budget that's about to close at the end of this month. So you can make relatively small investment in an organization's capacity can turn into a much larger one that is offering, in Chalkbeat's case, local news about public education to 7 communities, soon to be 8, every single day, and we can grow much more from there. This is not going to be easy, but it's also not so complicated.
Once again, you're watching the News Project Live. Please send us your questions and comments and say hello to us from wherever you're watching from. Alex?
Elizabeth, what do you think the responsibilities of Google, Facebook, and Twitter are in this moment when it comes to journalism? We've seen countries around the world try to hold them financially responsible for the journalism they use on their platforms. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, what do you guys think? I have a ton of thoughts. What do you think?
They have certainly undercut a lot of the advertising and financial base of journalism. So, it is not a bad idea. Elizabeth, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
I agree with you. I think that the companies there's 2 companies in our country that inherited the lion's share and more of the revenue of newspapers, and none of the social responsibility that newspapers took on for so many years. And so, there's a huge role for them to play, whether it's through philanthropy or taxation or both. Right. I think there's a lot to be done that means just investing straight up in the growth capital that we need. And it's completely possible for us to do that. We have more than enough wealth in this country, and we will still have more than enough wealth in this country. Even as we continue to face economic challenges, we will have more than enough wealth in this country to solve our local news problems. It's not the most expensive problem we face by far. The only obstacle is will we decide to invest that money? And I think that's another reason that I'm so proud to be part of a growing community. You guys are a part of it too. That is making the case, I think, so loudly and with increasing clarity that local news is a public good. Every single one of us has a role to play in supporting it. And, to those whom much is given, much should be expected in that endeavor.
If you have questions from the audience, please send them our way. We'd be happy to ask Elizabeth. We have time for a few more questions from us and from you. Elizabeth, you have taken a pretty loud, clear stand on government support for the efforts in local news. The industry, I would say, is divided on that question, with some in the journalism community worried about taking government money. Share with us why you're convinced that at least it seems to be a good idea.
Yeah, I have no interest at all in advancing propaganda, especially at this moment in time. No interest at all in that. But I do think that if we're honest about the scale of the local news gaps that we have, and also honest about the fact that this is a public good, then certainly as a taxpayer, I would be happy to have some of my taxpayers support independent journalism. Very happy to have that happen, whether that's through incentives that support local news indirectly, or through means of supporting independent local news in a more direct manner. I'm happy to support that as a taxpayer, and I don't see why journalism really should be all that different from the other public goods that we support together collectively as a public.
We have a question from a viewer, Rose Horowitz, who's asking about Chalkbeat and how much of your funding comes from private donors and from other sources, including the government.
We do not get any government support at Chalkbeat. This is all a bit of a pipe dream, but I think one that's worth taking a stand on and seeing what's possible. 85% of the support for Chalkbeat comes from philanthropic sources. The other 15% comes from commercial sources. As I said, We happily work with corporate sponsors who are interested in getting a message out to our readers. We also have a paid jobs board that our readers utilize. And we see lots of exciting opportunities to grow those sources of commercial revenue. We're also incredibly fortunate to work with many, many donors, readers, large foundations, medium-sized foundations, individual philanthropists who believe in our mission and support, again, independent journalism. Each of our locations has a robust base of local support. Our average grant size is $75,000. And we're just really grateful that so many people have stepped up and said, yes, I also believe in your mission, and I understand that without you, this news would not exist. And so they've supported us financially. We're incredibly grateful.
Before we wrap up with the last question, I just want to remind our viewers of next week's program. Next Thursday evening, our guest will be Neil Shapiro, who's the CEO of Channel 13, WNET in New York, and as such runs what is, by most standards, the largest and most impactful public television station in America. And we'll be talking about the state of public television, running a public television station in the current environment, and the challenges he's facing. So that's Neil Shapiro next Thursday on the News Project Live. And Elizabeth, I'm hoping we can have a little discussion about what we talk about as the local news movement, which really is more dramatic than a lot of people appreciate. There's a lot going on in local news around the country. There are hundreds and hundreds of local news sites that need support. Assess the state of that movement for us before we close.
Oh, I'm so excited. I love that you call it the local news movement. That's great. Yeah, it's exciting time to work in local news, even as it's a really deeply painful time. So many jobs are being lost or furloughed. But it's also exciting, I think, because in that real devastation for both the people who are losing their work and also the many, many people who depend on their work, which, is coming at such a crystallizing moment of clarity, I think, in the pandemic. Like, of course, we all need to know what our public health officials are doing, and we need to hold them accountable. And of course, we all need to know how our schools are going to reopen and what services our kids are being offered through remote learning. And of course, we need to know right now what our police departments are doing in response to this moment and who is holding them accountable, and look at all of the different proposals on the table with clear eyes and facts and have our voices heard. So it's such a clear galvanizing moment that we all need local news. And yet the commercial markets will not pay for it. I think that's just so stunningly clear right now as we see papers really crash across the country, that we're already on their last legs. It's an extinction moment, as one writer put it. And yet there is energy of people who are responding to that reality and have been responding to that reality for years, whether they're in Flint, Michigan, or in Oakland, California. And all of these people are journalists who believe in what we do and have the support of our communities around us. And so I find it to be really an exciting beginning.
Alex, you have a question yourself or from one of the audience?
No, I just wanted to acknowledge Aparna, our wonderful viewer, who said, a movement is the level of energy and insistence we need right now. So I think that's a wonderful closing thought. Merrill?
You have a closing thought, Elizabeth, for us? Like, how might people engage with the American Journalism Project if they're interested?
If you want to support AJP or Chalkbeat with your time or your money, you can go to our websites at chalkbeat.org and theajp.org.
Elizabeth, it's been great having you. Thank you for
having me.
What I'm sure is, like, every evening hectic around the Silver Spring household. Alex, enjoy your dad's big birthday coming up. To the viewers, please tune in next week for our conversation with Neil Shapiro from Channel 13 in New York. Have a nice week, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We appreciate your time. We appreciate your commitment to the issues of journalism that Elizabeth was so articulate and is so passionate about. You know where to get in touch with us at thenewsproject.net. Thank you and good night.